So here we have Dark Souls, the role-playing game. And I should go ahead and mention, this is not the standard edition. This is the collector's edition with the nice leather cover, and there's a bookmark and everything. It's actually really well done. And unfortunately, there's really nothing along the back. So let's read this, which I assume is supposed to be the back. So it is, Ash seeketh embers. Arise from the ashes, unkindled one. You stand in a world choked by darkness and fallen gods, where monsters seek warm flesh and the curse of undeath turns even the greatest heroes into something less than human. Now you must strive to restore the lords, link the flame, and lift the curse. Experience Dark Souls like never before in this complete tabletop role-playing game of adventure, horror, and tactical combat. Inside these pages is everything you need to run thrilling role-playing campaigns set in the ruinous Dark Souls universe. Complete 5th edition rules, 10 bespoke new character classes, brand new magic system, a GM chapter, visit the ruined world of Lothric, and a full bestiary teeming with Dark Souls creatures. Prepare to die. So let's pop this bad boy open and see what there is to be seen inside. This was published in 2022 by Steamforged Games, and well, that's kind of rather interesting because they've really only done board game. This is really their first role-playing game, and so they do have the license for Dark Souls, so why not? I really do like this table of contents page. It really makes sure that all of the chapters really stand out with these little mini tables, and you're gonna see this all throughout the book, and this book really does a great job at catching your eye and just layout wise making sure everything is clear and concise. So you have your prologue chapter, which is basically your what is a role-playing game chapter, your introduction chapter. Then you have character generation, core rules, magic and miracles, equipment, kindling the flame, which is the GM chapter, the world of Lothric, which is your lore chapter, and then you have the monsters and antagonists, which is your bestiary. And so, with that being said, let's not turn to the introduction prologue chapter, but character creation. For it being based off of the 5th edition system, character creation was surprisingly simple, more so than Dungeons & Dragons really is. There are really only 4 steps, 3 if you're not really into creating the character concept at first, as your first step. So first, you're really going to choose or randomly roll for your memory, your backstory, and your drive. Second, you're going to select your origin, which gives you your attribute scores and their modifiers. And then finally, you're going to select your class. This will give you your skills, your class abilities, and starting equipment. So aside from these 3 steps, there really isn't a whole lot of choosing. You don't have to assign attribute scores or anything like that. That's already settled for you, as is everything else. Its simplicity makes this an enjoyable experience, but I can also see this kind of turning off some people who are more used to having a plethora of options, like in Dungeons & Dragons. The backstory, the memory, and the drives, they all have some sort of a mechanical benefit. So you're not just choosing something for narrative perspective. These actually do give you some mechanical benefits, and you're usually going to invoke one of those 3 to gain advantage on some sort of a roll. If you invoke your memory, you're going to roll with advantage on 1 check of your choice. If you invoke your backstory, that allows you to roll with advantage on 1 saving throw of your choice. And if you invoke your drive, that will allow you to reroll 1 failed check or saving throw of any kind. Now, you do have to have some sort of a narrative way of explaining how this ties into that specific check, but it is a really useful tool in a game that is supposed to be very difficult. I really do like the separation of the origins and the classes and how that's all done. There's really only 4 origins. So you have the brute, and the brutes are really good at taking damage. And you can protect your party, drawing the enemy's ire. Dealing out pain, you're strong and deadly. With the right weapon, you're unstoppable. And brutes would make an excellent knight, mercenary, or warrior. I really do like the fact that they give you that little blurb there. And you can see that the brute has so much position, they have bloodied effect, so when you get down to a certain amount of position, you get a bloodied effect, and then you have their statistics or their attributes. Then you have the Fencer, and the Fencer is good at dealing damage. You're talented with multiple weapons, and you're a formidable opponent. Keeping out of harm's way, you're swift and able to dodge even the most accurate of blows. You would make an excellent assassin, thief, and herald. Then you have the Jack of all trades. And Jack of all trades are good at everything. You're capable of turning your hand to any task, no matter what it might be. Supporting your party by always having the right skill at the right time. You make an excellent herald, cleric, warrior, you name it, you can do it, and do it fairly well. Then there's the caster, and casters are good at exploiting an enemy's weakness. Your spells are great at dealing targeted damage. Hitting at range, you can stay away from the enemy's melee attacks, keeping up your attacks at distance. You make an excellent cleric, pyromancer, and sorcerer. The origins are all well and good, but there is one little teensy-weensy problem that I do have with this separation, is that each class clearly fits into one of these origins. So why would you bother mixing it up? In fact, the only one that really does kind of ask you to mix it up is the Jack of all trades. And you can easily explain, well, maybe I will start as a knight, but then switch over to like some sort of a like sorcerer class, so I'll do the caster. But then why wouldn't you just choose the Jack of all trades? Because that kind of has that similar purpose in a way, and probably in a less than desirable way. So that's my only real nitpick with this in separating the origin with the classes. It is kind of really only straightforward, and I don't really see anybody going out of their way to choose a different origin that doesn't really benefit their class. Speaking of classes, there are 10 of them, and each are representations of what you would find in the video games. However, this is more of a match between Dungeons & Dragons and the video games in terms of mechanics. So you have the Knight, a resolute warrior, well-armored and devoted to their cause. You have the Mercenary, a cunning warrior who uses 2 swords to cut down enemies. The Assassin is a killer from the shadows, appearing when least expected to finish their enemy. The Warrior is a brutal, indomitable northern fighter driven to berserk fury. You have the Thief, a master of the bow and a purloiner of objects that don't belong to them. You have the Herald, who is a stout warrior, determined to protect themselves and their friends and a wielder of miracles. And you have the Cleric, a faithful follower of the gods and a channel for their divine power on earth. Then you have the Sorcerer, a learned scholar whose power is derived from years of studying magical tomes. Then you have the Pyromancer, a wielder of magical fire, and not too shabby with an axe either. And last but not, and certainly the least, the Deprived, an unfortunate soul or an idiot. No one is entirely sure which. So, as you kind of go over through the different classes, you really do get a sense of how well this book has been laid out. So, each of the classes gets about 4 pages devoted to that specific class. So on the first page, you have what you get at each level, which is very familiar if you've seen the Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons. Then you've got a little blurb about that specific class and how it plays out in the lore-wise. And then you have their proficiencies and their starting equipment. Then you get into your actual class features. And it's different for every class, of course, but this is where they really took a lot of those concepts from Dungeons & Dragons and just kind of meshed them in here. And it fits very well, but you can obviously tell that this is a Dungeons & Dragons or 5th edition game. But I really do like this layout. It's so much more concise and clear than reading it from the Player's Handbook or any Wizards of the Coast product, which I do appreciate. And it is the same layout for each of the different classes. And then we get to the core rules. This is the obligatory, you'll only need this book to play the game, so here are the rules chapter. If you've ever played any 5th edition game, this is pretty much it. You have an explanation of skills and attributes, how to roll dice, and explanation of advantage and disadvantage. There is, however, one major difference, one addition that does set this apart from any other 5e product, and that is position. In Dark Souls, the role-playing game, careful management of health and stamina is critical to success. Unlike traditional role-playing games, Dark Souls, the role-playing game, doesn't use hit points to represent a character's vitality, and instead uses position. Position not only represents an abstraction of health and stamina, but also enables players to effect dice rolls and to use key abilities, adding a strategic layer to any combat action. Each character's base position is equal to their current level plus their constitution modifier and the maximum value of the dice in their position pool. If a character's position is reduced to 0, that character is killed. There are, however, some restrictions on position. So, if you're spending position, you can only ever spend position on yourself. You can't give them to allies. That just doesn't make any sense. You may only spend position once per turn, and you cannot trigger critical effects by spending position. Some of the common uses of using position is to increase the result of a dice roll by +1 per position. You can increase your melee or ranged attack damage roll by 5 points as a minimum, or you can increase your movement by 5 feet of movement per position spent. This is really what separates Dark Souls RPG from any other 5th edition game. And I'll get more into my opinions in the final thoughts. But when I first read this, I was very off-put by it. But as I got to thinking about it more and more, it really does try to emulate how Dark Souls, the video game, functions. And for that, I do appreciate it. There is a chapter on running the game, which is about what you would expect. There are tables, just random tables for, quest focuses, locations, encounters, NPCs, and bosses. There is actually an optional rule, which I find really funny, for summonings, which is useful if you're playing solo or in a small party, but as a large group of maybe 4 or 5 players, I really wouldn't see myself needing to use this, but it is funny or interesting that it is there. So you do have your standard like white summon signs, golden summon signs, red summon signs, and then the purple summon signs, which all kind of summon different characters for you. But I thought that was rather interesting that they did try to implement that into the game as an optional rule. To better match the video games, magic has been reworked quite a bit. First, there are 20 spell levels, which I've always wondered what it would look like if Dungeons & Dragons had implemented such a system. Like every level you could have access to newer spells and things like that. Obviously, with the smaller spell pool in this game, you're not likely to get a spell every level or access to a spell every level, but it is nice that it is very clear and concise that, at 11th level, you could get this such and such spell. Additionally, though, each spell, not spell level, but each actual spell can be cast so many times before a long rest is needed. And one thing that I really do like, that I don't see a whole lot of nowadays, is that some spells actually take more than one turn to cast. These are going to usually be your more powerful spells, and I really do like that concept. So what about the spells themselves? Well, there are 3 categories of spells. You have your pyromancer spells, you have your sorceries, and then you have your miracles. Each of those, of course, would translate to one of the classes, or several of the classes, like pyromancers, the one that gets the pyromancer spells. There are certain classes that get sorceries, and then your divine classes would get your miracles. And each has different spells, of course, that are easily recognizable from the game. And I would like to point out, I find it really funny, but it's also really ingenious that they use the graphics from the video games themselves to represent, like this is the Firestorm graphic, or at least I'm going to assume it is. I have not actually double checked because I have not played Dark Souls 1, 2, or 3 in a very long time. But when we get to the equipments chapter, you're going to see this again, or those same icons. Not like the same icons, but icons that are similar in that style. So let's take a look at some of these spells. So we have Fireball. Casting time is a bonus action. You get 3 casts just by equipping it. Its duration is instantaneous, and it's a range of 120 feet, a level 1 spell. You create a small ball of flame and hurl it at a chosen target creature within range. The enemy creature suffers 1d6 plus your spellcasting ability modifier fire damage, or half damage on a successful dexterity saving throw against your spell DC. So nothing out of the ordinary from what you would expect from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So let's take a look at another spell. Let's do Heavy Soul Arrow from the Sorceress. This one takes 2 actions to cast. It has 5 casts, it's instantaneous, and its range is 250 feet. It's a level 15 spell. Something that I didn't really mention is that each of the spells does have an attunement cost or an attunement slot. So if you've ever played Dark Souls, it's the same thing. You need so many, you have so many equipment, you have so many slots that you could equip spells to. You have to have the right amount of slots open in order to equip such a spell. This spell costs 1 position as well. You create a glowing orb of magical force. On a successful spell attack roll, it strikes a creature of your choice that you can see within range. The orb deals 8d6 plus 8 force damage to its target, or half damage on successful dexterity saving throw against your spell DC. You can increase the number of orbs cast by this spell at a cost of 5 position per additional orb cast. This additional orb can be cast at the same or at a different target. So very powerful indeed. Let's take a look at one more, a miracle perhaps. Here is a healing spell from the miracles. We have Great Heal. It has an attunement slot of 2 and it costs 1 position to cast. The casting time is 2 actions. It has 2 casts, instantaneous, a range of touch, and it's spell level 12. You channel your faith, restoring health and more. A creature you touch regains a number of position equal to 10d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. You can also reduce the target's exhaustion level by 1 or end one of the following effects on the target. 1 effect that charmed or petrified the target. 1 curse, including the target's attunement to a cursed magic item. Any reduction to one of the target's ability scores caused by dying or any other reason. So, a very powerful healing ability. I think it's probably it's the top tier healing ability. So that is actually it for the spells. Compared to a game like Dungeons & Dragons, there certainly aren't as many, but I would say that, depending on what kind of a build you're going for, they're all certainly useful in a combat sort of way. The equipment chapter is actually my favorite chapter in this entire book, mainly because of all the options you have if you should actually acquire the gear. Now, equipment is also simplified as opposed to the D&D counterpart. Simply put, you have 15 equipment slots and 5 active slots. The 5 active slots refer to the armor or gear you are wearing or intent on using. You have an armor slot, a left-hand ring slot, right-hand ring slot, left-hand weapon slot, or right-hand weapon slot, and that's pretty much it. And then other than that, you can only carry 15 pieces of equipment. So it really limits things down, but hey, you are not a party that's supposed to be carrying tons and tons of weight and just selling it at a vendor. Yeah, no more of that. Something that I will say is that some of the equipment does cost more than 1 equipment slot to carry, so the heavier the item, the more slots you're going to be using out of that 15. If you've ever played the video games, then a lot of the gear here will be very familiar. And what I really do like about these pieces of equipment, specifically the armor and all the weapons, is that they all have some sort of a special effect. Let's take the Avla armor, for example. Alva, the Seeker of the Spurned, wore this armor in the past. Has an AC of 18, requires a strength of 12. Its special effect is, whenever wearing the Alva armor, you have disadvantage on all wisdom saving throws. So not all pieces of equipment will have a positive effect. The Archdeacon robes has a special effect. Whenever wearing the Archdeacon robes, you may choose to regain all casts of 1 miracle without long resting. This miracle must be of a level equal to half your character level, rounded down to a minimum of 1st level. This ability can be used once per long rest. Or the Armor of Favor. When wearing the Armor of Favor, you may re-roll 1 failed saving throw per long rest. So every single piece of equipment, from armor to weapons and all of that, they all have some sort of a special effect. And it's really varied in their effects too, which is very nice. My only complaint here is that there doesn't seem to be any boss weapons. In the video games, you could take the souls of the boss and you craft a special weapon from it. And that seems to be absent here. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any sort of crafting or way to level up your equipment at all, which I think is a big factor in the Souls-like games. Then we have the lore chapter, and this is, at least to me, the biggest disappointment of the book, and that really isn't its fault. Some find the mysteries of each game and how some of its lore is obscured from one entry to the next to be part of the charm, and I'm not really one of those people. To try to connect all the dots from one entry to another would require a great deal of speculation, as there doesn't seem to be anything that specifically or definitively answers a lot of the questions out there. The book tells you this up front. There is no speculation here, only the known facts, and it is up to you as a GM to fill in the gaps if you so wish it. So what is here? Well, there's actually 14 different locations from the video games that you can use, and each have items that you can discover while exploring, some NPCs, or some bosses. Some of the locations also have a table for random encounters, but not all of them do, because some of the places are not really for fighting, like the Firelink Shrine. There's also no bosses. So out of all the 14 locations, we have Cemetery of Ash, Firelink Shrine, Undead Settlement, Cathedral of the Deep, the Road of Sacrifices, Catacombs of Karthus, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, Irithyll Dungeon, Farron Keep, Profaned Capital, Anor Londo, Lothric Castle, the Grand Archive, and Archdragon Peak. So those are your 14 locations, and I really do like how it's all on a 2-page spread, one with artwork of that location, and then one with all of the relevant information. And then at last we have the monster manual section of the book, monsters and antagonists. The first thing you're probably going to notice is that most, if not all, of these monsters and bosses are just D&D monsters with a new picture and some of the relevant lore dumped in there. Do I have a problem with it? Not really, but if you were expecting some new stats and abilities to really make this game stand out, then you're going to be severely disappointed. The best thing about this chapter, however, are the bosses. Now, it should also be worth mentioning that these bosses, most of them, I haven't really found a direct comparison to all of them, but most of these bosses are just rehashes of higher level D&D monsters. Out of the bosses, we have Yurix Gundyr, Vort of the Boreal Valley, Curse Rotted Greatwood, Deacons of the Deep, the Archdeacon, Old Demon King, Yorm the Giant, Dancer of the Boreal Valley, Black Dragon Calamite, the Crystal Sage, Gaping Dragon, Sif the Great Grey Wolf, Sir Artorius the Abyss Walker, Nameless King, and the King of Storms, Soul of Cinder, Lorien, Elder Prince, Lothric, Younger Prince, Pontiff Solivan, Aldrich, Devourer of the Gods, and that is it. I should also mention that, as you've probably already noticed by now, the artwork throughout this entire book is phenomenal. I really do like the artwork. It definitely is Dark Souls, so there is that. I do not know, however, if this is all original or if it is direct from the actual Dark Souls games. So don't quote me on anything. I just haven't done the research to find out just yet. This was an interesting book to read through. Not just because it's another 5e clone, but rather how it takes an established setting from a video game nonetheless and really molds it to fit a system. Does it do its job? Yes, I think it does, but it's rather flawed. My main issue with this game is the product in general. Why do we even need this? I could really actually just do my research on the Dark Souls wiki and take that whole world, make it my own, and just take the 5th edition setting and just put it in there, homebrew it a little bit. I could do that. I could put in the elbow grease and really make that work. Then there's the world itself. This is not a setting that I have ever would have thought that I'd want to play in a tabletop RPG setting. When you play the video game, you're always the lone wanderer for most of the game. I mean, you can summon some NPCs to help you out or some other players to help you out, but it's really meant to be solo. And as such, the world that you play in itself is really just empty for the most part. I mean, you do have the enemies and creatures and monsters and things like that. And the NPCs are sparse, which is my main problem with Dark Souls and playing it as a tabletop RPG. There aren't going to be NPCs to give you quests in the video games and things like that. So to translate that into a tabletop RPG, you're really fundamentally changing what Dark Souls is really all about. It's really just a matter of go here or travel through this area, fight all the enemies and hope you don't die, or else you have to do it all over again, and make it to the boss, fight the boss, and then go on to the next area and just do the same thing. There really isn't a social aspect to Dark Souls. I mean, sure, you could talk to NPCs and gain their lore in the video games, but that doesn't really translate very well to a role-playing game tabletop-wise. This would actually be something that I would take the lore for and just toss it out the window and just take the little tweaks and changes that they've done here, like magic and position, and just make my own dark universe or dark setting, I guess. There's actually only one feature, well, two if you really want to count magic and that whole reworking, but there's really one feature that is substantially different than 5th edition, and that is position. Position is really what makes this game stand out to me. And when I first read through it, I was baffled by it. Like, why wouldn't they just separate, HP from stamina and magic, or whatever that blue bar is in Dark Souls 3? Why wouldn't they just separate those three out? But then I had to remember that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is about being a hero in a fantasy setting. It's really hard to die in Dungeons & Dragons, in my opinion. Like, the power creep in that game is just so outstanding. You are always more powerful. You have an abundance of hit points and abilities to use and things like that. So position, what it does, it is a resource, that one resource that you have to really manage well. It's your HP. It's the resource that you can spend for abilities and other things. You can spend it. Once it's all gone, though, you are dead. And that right there is what makes this stand out. It re-emphasizes that theme in Dark Souls, death and rebirth. Position, you're going to spend it if you want to do the cool things. You're going to spend it. You're going to lose it. And when you do, you're dead and you're back at the bonfire again. I really think that 5th edition was the wrong fit for a Dark Souls RPG. It just doesn't really flesh very well. I think it would have been better if they had done a system from the ground up and just worked with that. But the reason why I think they should have gone with their own system is because of how classes work. When you pick a class, you're kind of devoting your time and effort into that class, and you're gaining abilities, and that really takes away the free form, the freedom of building your character from the video games. It just doesn't really equate to that. You're limiting what you can do. You can't spec into strength to get that weapon, and then into attunement to get some spell slots, and then pyromancy to get some of the pyromancy spells. It just doesn't really work that way here. You're devoted to a class, and as you level up in that class, you're gaining the next ability for that class, unless you want a multi-class, which they didn't even mention in this book. So is it really a thing? Can you do it? I assume so. It's just a matter of choosing a different class and getting all the things at level 1 for that class, but they never really mention it, and that's a shame. I really do think that Steamforged Games could have done even more, done even a greater thing if they had just committed the time and effort to building a system from the ground up to make it emulate the video games more, because there are some really good ideas that do emulate the video games. It's just overall, it doesn't really flesh very well together. So that's all that I have for you this time. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support the series, and I will see you guys in the next video.